and I'm juggling screens here to make the most of my screen for you so you can see the slides and I can see my text. It's my great privilege to be your MC for this afternoon's webinar. We in Aotearoa, along with the rest of the world, are facing two substantial challenges. We need an effective economic stimulus to get us out of our deepest recession in 100 years. And we also need to slash our climate pollution to stop the climate crisis deepening drastically. These twin challenges will not be solved unless healthy, less polluting places for people are put at the heart of the solutions. This is the most important time ever for the building and construction sector in Aotearoa. Our sector has a key role to play in tackling era-defining problems, and that's what makes this year's World Green Building Council so vital. The campaign to act on climate is threefold. For communities, net zero buildings support a healthier and more sustainable built environment, creating thriving and resilient communities. For the planet, because buildings account for more than 1/3 of global carbon emissions. It's vital that we prioritise net zero buildings today to protect our climate and future generations. And then net zero buildings for economies. Investing in new and existing net zero buildings today can stimulate innovation, supply chains, and create jobs. To act on these, the New Zealand Green Building Council is hosting this week a series of panel discussions tackling the big issues. Can a shovel-ready approach ever truly solve fundamental problems? Can the financial services industry be a catalyst for change? And how can we fully realise the enormous potential for social and green procurement? The title for our webinar this afternoon is 5 Million People, 1,000 Days, One Big Idea. On October the 17th, we go to the polls to choose which party or parties will govern us in Aotearoa for the next 3 years, or roughly 1,000 days. If there's one thing the new government should focus on, what should that be? Get it right, don't mess it up. And can we achieve extraordinary things in those 1,000 days? But just think how ambitious and innovative, how successful and resilient we've been in just the past 200 days or so since COVID-19 upended our lives, shook us out of whatever relative zones of comfort, routine and certainty we were in. And we have to achieve extraordinary things in these 1,000 days. Given the state of the planet, economy and society, we must have to have transformative change to deliver absolutely crucial progress. And if we don't make the most of these 1,000 days, the task only gets bigger. We will only make life even harder for ourselves and for each other. But the pandemic is helping us, equip us and inspire us. Here's one of my favourite quotes so far for these virus times. Quote, COVID-19 has already triggered major shifts in individual behaviours and social practices, beliefs, the role of government in the economy, and relationships between nations and international institutions. These shifts have occurred on remarkably rapid timescales. From these wise words are from the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford University, when it released in May its seminal analysis on how we can and how we must build back better. So that we can help send a powerful message on these issues to our politicians and to our next government, we've brought together a panel of people with deep expertise, strong opinions, and lively personalities to help our discussion this evening. So expect some fireworks as they bring their thoughts and ideas to life, while we're inviting you, our audience, to put your own voice and votes behind the pitch each panelist makes to you. So 10 panelists, 10 pitches. So we can send a strong message to the beehive, to whoever will be in charge of the government post-election. But first, there's a bit of housekeeping, because we're using Slido for two purposes. So please, could you open up a browser window and type in Slido, slido.com, and then Act on Climate. I'm just going to very briefly show you that slide. So there you have the slide with the details of slido.com and hashtag Act on Climate. I'll just give you a few moments to log into that before I continue. And the other reason that, so the purpose for using Slido is that once we've had our panelists each make their big wish, their pitch, we will then ask you to go to Slido to vote on the one that you feel most strongly about, so we can get a sense of where interests lie. Now, the second reason for using Slido is that that's how we would love to hear your questions. So please type your questions into the Q&A tab on Slido, and then we will, Lena and her colleagues at the Green Building Council will then post those into our conversation. So they'll be masterminding that. And lastly, we are very much encouraging you to please tweet this evening during our webinar, or later on this evening, or even in coming days, at hashtag Act on Climate and hashtag AKL Conversations, because of the wonderful support of Auckland Conversations. So now it's my very great pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Mark Todd, who is Managing Director of Ockham Residential, an apartment developer, which he founded with Benjamin Preston in 2009 during the global financial crisis. And most of Ockham's 12 completed developments so far, you'll find a foundation plaque with the inscription "Built for Auckland," which is very much the motto of Ockham. Now, Mark is going to have to leave us shortly before we start the Q&A, so we'll miss him on that, because he's off to launch the marketing of the Oroha building in Avondale, Ockham's latest building. So Mark, welcome to you, and we very much look forward to hearing your pitch, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Rod. And I've never done an online webinar, so forgive my any false moves I make, but I'm excited about it. So we'll get right into it. I'm sure these other panelists that have more expertise in the details of green building. My pitch is at more of a global level to help us reach net zero in the building and construction sector. And it's a message for the government to take cities seriously. Let's not let our landowners shape our cities. And just like bring back buck, I want to bring back town planning. So firstly, I thank you for the last 1,000 days. There was a national policy statement released about 8 weeks ago that mandated the removal of minimum car parking standards in all urban centres across the country. Now that's a huge step in net zero carbon, a big brave step, and it's global across the country. And that national policy statement also mandated minimum zoning of 6 levels within a 5-minute walk of any current or future mass transit node. So we are moving in the right directions as far as net zero, saving our world, building communities and new housing with a lower carbon footprint. My pitch is for the government over the next 1,000 days to have another national policy statement that unlocks the existing urban and suburban environment across the country. And that is a national policy statement that removes density controls that have been our Achilles heel for 2 generations now in unlocking carbon neutral city building and planning for carbon neutral public transport systems, allowing people to live where they want to live, in high value, high amenity areas. It's been, my view is that the previous the national policy statement released 8 weeks ago, there was not a whimper. There has been a narrative for the last 30 years that it's nanny state to have national policy statements like this that take away communities' rights. But I think given the enormity and urgency of climate change, the biggest step we can do to get closer to carbon zero building in communities is have people living close to where they work, close to where after hours amenities are, close to where existing schools are, close to where existing infrastructure is. That's a huge step in the right direction, and that is my pitch. So that means stepping on the toes of the big money land players that drive outcomes that are largely ad hoc and divorced from the concept of city building or town planning. So as well as being a huge step in the right direction towards a carbon zero residential building sector, it's also a huge step in the right direction for community building and weaving together our communities that's become fragmented with density controls. Density controls, aside from driving sprawl, they also drive socioeconomic stratification, and that there's a lack of choice in high value suburbs. You've got expensive housing or very expensive housing. So that's another, not related to green building per se, but definitely related to the green issue, the suite of green issues, which is socioeconomic stratification. That's my pitch. Keep it going. Don't be afraid. Be bold. Let's use some national policy statements to get some cut through and some action. And let's start a discussion about how we want our cities to be and look like. We've got slow motion train wrecks happening down in Tauranga, driven by landholders that own farmland that's high value. We've got train wrecks happening in Napier, Wanaka, Auckland itself. Let's not let landowners drive the narrative and shape our cities. Let's do it together with national policy statements that are debated in the political arena. I think that's my 3 minutes, isn't it, Rod? I hope so.
It's good. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. And certainly the call for some rational urban design and development in Auckland to get away from the sprawl is about and taking cities seriously is a great pitch. So thank you very much indeed. So now it's my great pleasure to move on to Jacqueline Paul. And Jacqueline is of Ngāti Tuwhararoa, Ngāti Puhoi, and Ngāti Kahanganui ki Haratonga descent, and is currently a researcher at Ngā Waiate Tui Māori and Indigenous Research Centre, and lecturer at the School of Architecture in Landscape Architecture at the Unitec Institute of Technology. Jacqueline is also an appointed member and independent specialist of the Urban Housing Development and Planning Committee at Kāinga Ora, Homes and Communities, formerly known as Housing New Zealand. And in addition to other roles, Jacqueline is heading off to the United Kingdom soon to pursue a master's in philosophy and planning, growth and regeneration in the Department of Land Economy at the University of Cambridge. Kia ora, Jacqueline, and we very much look forward to hearing your pitch.
Tēnā koe, Rod. Thank you for the introduction. I thought let's get straight into it. And for those who have seen my pitch or our wish, a long wish for some time is to think about honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And although it can be really high level, and I know the discussion is around 3 years, but I mean, 180 years too, so it's all accumulated. So great time to have a discussion and think about the relevance of that within this context. I thought I might just briefly overview, in terms of really understanding that Māori were guaranteed sovereignty and chieftainship over kāinga. So really understanding what does that mean for us as both tangata whenua and tangata tiriti. Over the last kind of term, under this Labour government, coalition government, we saw tamariki, or children, being uplifted by the state, Māori babies. We saw marae be targeted and fast-tracked in legislation. Uhu mātau with contentious land issues. So really understanding, yes, we need houses, but not at the cost of, protected and cultural landscapes. Thinking about the declining home ownership for Māori, an increase in homelessness. So really it's not me walking down and seeing, architecture and planning and spaces that perhaps look like me or reflect any type of Māori identity, but actually it's whānau living on the streets who look like me. And so really grounding that in terms of this kaupapa. Thinking about, water issues where we're seeing water restrictions in Tāmaki Makaurau, but also some of the issues around bottling water and selling that off shores. So some of those contentious issues. State of our rivers and lakes, climate change, prominent issue. Kai and food poverty, especially for our whānau and young people and children, especially for Māori. The number of Māori children in state care, prison and justice, welfare and income, and a major increase in suicide rates and mental health. So we know that's an overview, and it's been an ongoing issue since the, colonisation took place on these shores. But it's really a reflection, right? 100 years later, we're still thinking about what does transformation look like in this day and age. And I think it's really important that we bring it to the forefront of this conversation. Let's think about, why do houses earn far more than the living wage? Let's think about the equity gaps for us as Māori and non-Māori. What does it mean to understand, whenua and land that we all live on? Our whānau and our communities, the kai and the food that we share. And as a reflection, right, we think about through the pandemic, the need for kai and how reliant we are on institutions and systems like supermarkets, and why we don't use our own backyards to grow and harvest our own food. So really it's things that we know. It's been a long time as whānau Māori across the nation. But what does that partnership look like for us as a people, as a nation in this country? So just reflecting on, World Green Building Week, where it speaks about communities, which is about whānau, which speaks about for the planet, but also for us, it's about whenua and land. The concept of net zero buildings for economies, for us around understanding kāinga and the way in which, and I know Mark Todd mentioned that around the socio-cultural organisations that we operate, and how does that look like for us as both, non-Māori and Māori? We operate in different organisations and social groupings, but we still have to live together. So what does that look like, and how we can continue to really think about what true partnership looks like in this? And for me, that means shifting power, shifting resources, and really recognising different knowledge systems to benefit not only us, but for everyone. We've seen some challenges in our industries, I'm sure, and a huge reason why I didn't go directly into mainstream organisations and have grounded myself in kaupapa Māori spaces. There's a reflection of those who look like me, think like me, sound like me, and it wasn't a safe space for me to operate. And I hope you think about that in the spaces that we all work in, and what does that mean, and how do we continue to provide that cultural support for emerging professionals and practitioners coming through. And I know that comes through, there's a major need and gap within education, which is why I've positioned myself there, so that we can ensure that we grow that cultural adequacy and literacy in our spaces. Because for too long we've seen, major issues, especially with land, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the need for us to grow and shift that thinking that has continuously been dominated by non-Māori anyway. So let's honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi within this space. Let's continue to advocate and push for that. Let's not only think about, for government and their role, but the diverse spaces we work at. And what does that mean to be a good treaty partner in the context, no matter where we are? Because if your response or solutions don't look like Māori or include any Māori or Te Tiriti, then are you really perpetuating colonisation and racism in the work that we do and continue to perpetuate the issues that will have ongoing effects for us and our mokopuna? So I really want to put that at the forefront. And think about, opportunities like Indigenous procuring services, economic stimulus, right? But just thinking about the little people. So I really want to really emphasise that in this kōrero. So quick fire pitch from me. Let's continue to honour Te Tiriti. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you very much indeed, Jacqueline. And that's a very, very fine pitch to make because of the great wealth of energy and knowledge and culture that then would start to flow through in all of our conversations as we share these things together. So thank you. It's now, let me just remind you with this slide you're seeing up there, if you've got questions for panelists, please do use the Q&A tab on Slido. And if you're not yet in Slido, please do go to slido.com and then put in this event code, and then you'll be able to vote in due course and then send us some questions. So thank you. And our third panelist is Alec Tang, who's Auckland Council's Acting Chief Sustainability Officer. Alec and his team work across Auckland Council's diverse operations and alongside Auckland's mana whenua, matawaka, communities and business to help deliver the system shifts required for this future, from infrastructure, provision and service delivery through to funding and decision making. And of course, Alex and his team have been very involved in the development and the successful adoption by Council of Auckland's climate plan, which sets a path for rapid decarbonisation in line with the region's 1.5 degree centigrade commitment, whilst also preparing the region for the impacts of climate change. So welcome, Alec. Great to have you on the webinar, and over to you.
Kia ora, Rod. Thanks for the introductions. Tēnā koutou kua whākarok mai. Hopefully you can see me. I can't see myself, but hope you can hear me. Ko Alec Tang toki ingoa e mahi ana hei poarahi mō te taritikanga tōkanga roa mātua I te kainiero Tāmaki Makaurau. So as Rod said, I'm the Acting Chief Sustainability Officer. Great to be here. Always difficult to follow on from Jacqueline and some great comments there. Look, I'm going to have to admit, I've really struggled with this one. I've really struggled to decide on one key area, one focus for the incoming government, because I feel like there's just still so much change that needs to happen. Our approach to practically every significant issue that we have is insufficient. Climate change, housing, economic development, growth. We've heard it before, we need transformative action, not just business as usual with a bit of gloss. And there are still so many underlying issues that need to be resolved if we have any hope of meeting our climate goals and creating a more sustainable, resilient, generative future. As Rod highlighted, our work on Te Tarakia Tāwhiri, Auckland's climate plan, has shown us that halving our emissions by 2030 is not plausible without bold and ambitious change across all sectors. Decarbonising business as usual just won't cut it. We have this ongoing obsession with delivering more houses, but as long as houses remain primarily an income generation opportunity for a lucky few, rather than a safe, healthy, stable foundation for whānau to thrive, then we're not going to address the housing crisis in front of us. So we need to think about a whole range of things completely differently. So at a real macro scale, my ask of government is to ask different questions. Obviously the way that we're addressing things right now, the questions that we're currently asking aren't the right questions. Transport is one of our biggest emission sources, but why are we moving things around the way that we are? We're just currently thinking about an existing model and trying to perpetuate that model with a little bit less carbon, and that's just not going to cut it. As Rod highlighted, the good news for me is that COVID's given us this opportunity to do that, to rethink our priorities, to challenge what is normal. But it's also shown us how quickly we can revert back to our previous status quo if we're not insistent on change. COVID's also shown us what's really important. And for me, one of those key things is that COVID has highlighted the strength of our communities and unity of action are critical in these times of crisis and transformation. We can't deal with massive disruptive issues like COVID, like our escalating climate crisis as individuals. Like it or not, and there are many that don't like this, we all need each other and we all have a part to play. So my idea actually for today is less a priority for the next 3 years, but it's really an opportunity for now. Something to help strengthen and revitalize our local communities that will be so crucial going forward as we hit more times of stress. And I think Mark kind of mentioned this. In my ideal world, I think right now what we should be doing is funneling all this investment that's currently going into development sprawl that just reinforces our car dependence, that adds to our regional emissions, that pushes us further away from each other, stretches our already stressed city systems. We should actually put all that energy, all that resource and capability into revitalizing local. Use it to take those empty local high street shops that we hear about, turn them into drop-in office spaces for all those locals who no longer want to or need to travel every day into the central city. We'll turn them into community hubs where our rangatahi can express their individuality, amplify their energy, and maybe use them as spaces where those who unfortunately, and we know many have lost their jobs through COVID, but let's use those spaces to retain them to work in more resilient low carbon industries. For me, we should use these half-empty office spaces, I'm in one of them, into apartments for living, but also that critical social infrastructure that is needed to support our communities. For me, I think we need to be focusing more on building strong communities and the places and spaces that support them. It's not just about building more houses. So that's my pitch is for more revitalization of local, using the funding that we're actually currently funneling into unsustainable emissions increasing sprawl into what we have now, into strengthening those communities that we need to get through these crises that we're increasingly facing. That's it from me. Hopefully that's a good pitch for everybody.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Alex, because that sense of revitalizing community where there's a strong sense of a common understanding of what needs to be done and a common purpose about doing it, and then generating real strength and wealth from all of that, wealth in all senses, not just economic, is a tremendously important one. And so thank you for making that pitch for revitalizing local. And now our fourth panelist is Jade Kake, who leads a small team at Matakoe Architecture and Urbanism, a kaupapa Māori design studio that works with Māori organisations on their marae, papakainga and civic projects, and mana whenua groups to express their culture values and narratives through the design of their physical environment. So with a studio in Whangarei, Matakoe are currently working on a range of projects across Te Tai Tokoro from Kaitaia through to Tamaki Makaurau. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, Jade, and we eagerly await your pitch, please.
Oh, tēnā koutou. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's so great to be here with you all. As our 3 minutes is short, I think I'll try to quickly crack through some of the issues as I understand them and move on to some potential solutions. And so I see myself as really wearing two fortai, and the first and most important one is actually just as a hapu member, and secondly as a practitioner. And being a hapu member and the work that I do for my hapu informs my approach to practice. So I don't think of my professional role as the kind of paramount thing in this discussion or really any other. And so from our hapu perspective, actually we've got a lot of issues. And so I'm from Ngāpuhi, as is Jackie, and being pre-settlement, we have a lot of issues with the Crown continually bringing new take to us on their terms. And so we're often forced into a situation of having to be very reactive, responsive to new changes, many of them negative. And so some of our current issues are around our catchment. For example, the government has decided to form a catchment group over the Kaipara Harbour, which impacts our hapu and whangare. We're not on that group. A lot of powers are going to be delegated, and really they're trying to get things shuffling along because we're taking too long with our settlement. But they've cut us completely out of the process. And so that's one more fire that we have to fight. We also have issues around, treaty settlements. So in Whangarei, we have 3 overlapping mandates, which is Ngāti Whātua, Ngāti Wai, and Ngāpuhi. And again, we keep having issues where the Crown seeks to impose their process upon us, which actually has really tangible impacts on what happens in our rohe and to our environment and to our people. And so I hope we're really busy with those kind of things. And then more on a whānau level, we have issues around the quality of rural housing. So whānau live in really appalling conditions in really substandard dwellings that wouldn't be considered acceptable by urban standards. And then we also have issues around, just regulatory and financial barriers to developing housing on whenua Māori, which, is only 5% of the land that's available, but even that small amount is very difficult to develop. And so I guess with my professional hat, I'm working with whānau and hapu clients who are looking to develop housing, and that regulatory and financial barriers are biggie. And most of the clients I work with really strongly advocate an approach that would see them be, kaitiaki, best practice in environmental stewardship. And this is really high aspiration, but there's such a limitation on the funding that's available, and sometimes a limitation on the products and materials that are available locally. And sometimes there's an unpleasant trade-off where affordability ends up kind of trumping environmental outcomes, which is not what we want. But I think there are some blockages in terms of financial and regulatory barriers. And so my solution, and I think I said quite a broad one, which might have been for shock value, but I really mean it. And so what I said is that we really should be giving hapu our land back, and we should prioritise constitutional transformation as a national priority. And so many will be familiar with Matike Mai, which is a kaupapa that was led out by Moana Jackson and Makere Mutu, which was really thinking about if we were to take Te Tiriti o Waitangi and He Whakaputanga seriously, what would that mean for the way we govern this country? And it's actually quite an uplifting document that sets out something that I think would be of benefit to everybody and not just Māori. And so if we're getting good outcomes for hapu and we're, honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi, I think we'll see a lot of the issues that face, a lot of whānau due to, income stratification, income inequality, due to, issues of wealth or wealth inequality would be mitigated by restructuring in a way that would be in the interest of everybody. So I guess what I'm trying to say is hapu interests are for the common interest, where I'm not always convinced that our system of political representation is, because there's people fighting for their own self-interest and then, electing people who try to form a government and work together. And there's pros and cons in that. But I think that, as hapu, we're not adequately represented, and Te Tiriti o Waitangi isn't reflected in our system of government, although it's reflected in some legislation to some degree. And my smaller ideas that flow out of that are really around the ability of Kāinga Ora to develop land in partnership with iwi hapu. And my big extra point that isn't currently in government policy is, what if Kāinga Ora worked in partnership with hapu, developed that land, and then worked through a managed transition and hand back? So hand back developed land rather than empty land that you then have to somehow commercialize and make a profit to be able to eventually provide scholarships and dividends to your members. What if there was a planned transition of the development that you worked on together in partnership? Because I think we really do need to decommodify land. I think that's really the big issue. And although I don't think that can happen overnight because of the way that our land tenure system has been set up and the way housing has been financialized to such a great degree, but I think if anything has power, it's the government and it's Kāinga Ora that can cut through some of this. And maybe that's the way we start to make housing accessible and affordable to everybody as a basic human right. But I think that hapu really needs to be central to that process in their rohe. And my other government pitch was around a national policy statement for Papa Kāinga. I think that would be really helpful because the provisions for Papa Kāinga are really varied across all different district and regional councils. And so this could provide the opportunity to set some high-level principles and require councils to take this seriously, because the provisions are so variable and really not function in a lot of areas, or they don't exist in others. And it's quite hard to make any progress when the plan provisions are completely against you. So I think that's my pitch and my time done. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora. Thank you very much indeed, Jade. Some tremendously challenging ideas there, particularly around some very, very different approaches to land and to settlements. Thank you. And now it's my very great pleasure to welcome our fifth panellist, Leonie Freeman, who is the Chief Executive of the Property Council New Zealand. Leonie is a very well-respected industry leader with very extensive experience in both the public and private sector. And in 2011, she was appointed to the board of NZX-listed Goodman Property Trust. And up until her 2018 appointment at the Property Council, she dedicated her time to leading an independent philanthropic initiative to solve Auckland's housing crisis. So welcome, Leonie, and we're very keen to hear your pitch, please. Thank you.
No one can be happy about where we are with housing. And if we can't find a path to solving our housing issues, the future looks bleak. It's a picture of rampant house prices, people living in cars and garages, more congestion, rapidly rising rents, housing supply at a trickle, and many of our people, our young in particular, giving up on any hope of owning a home in New Zealand. It is increasingly obvious that no single idea, no single organisation or no single person is going to be able to fix this problem. We all know there's a lot going on by many organisations in this space, right across the country and across all parts of the housing continuum. Property Council is heavily involved in this space, and our recently published election platform highlights a raft of recommended priorities for government. This includes reforming the Resource Management Act, reintroducing depreciation for multi-unit residential buildings, and championing the creation of a build-to-rent housing sector, to name a few. But on top of this, however, together we all need to take a major systemic shift in how we approach this problem and stop the very, very siloed approach. The solution is often described as collective impact, and it's been used all around the world to solve complex and seemingly intractable large-scale social problems. It involves bringing everybody together, all the players involved, government, council, private sector, iwi, community housing, finance, and others, all who have a stake in the issue to work together towards the same goal. There are many success stories of collective impact all around the world, but the People's Project, which has effectively ended rough sleeping in central Hamilton, is one of my close to home favourites. Successful collective impact initiatives involve three key steps. Number one, we start with a vision and KPIs, because without a clear sense of what we are driving towards, we are rudderless. Two, we create a structure, which is typically a small non-for-profit entity whose sole job is to coordinate all the stakeholders involved and keep the focus on outcomes. And three, finally, a unified long-term action plan, which is about accountability and ensuring we deliver on our promises and actually get things done. Kiwis are saying enough is enough about issues with housing. And I want something better for all New Zealanders. So my one big idea today is to implement a collective impact initiative to fix New Zealand's housing issues. Thank you.
Fine, thank you very much indeed, Leonie. A very powerful concept about collective impact, and I hope we'll have a chance to, in the discussion, to hear a bit more about that from you. Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our sixth panellist, Chris Barton, an architecture critic and editor of Architecture New Zealand. Chris has a long background in journalism. Indeed, he and I used to work together at the Herald, which was, I always appreciated Chris's work. But also a background in architectural training and education, hence his role at the University of Auckland now. So Chris, over to you, please, for your pitch.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me, Rod?
Yeah, oh, that's good. Thank you.
So I was going to just share some slides, if that's all right.
Yes, please do.
So can I just go ahead and do that?
Yep, you share screen. There you go.
Right. So this idea begins with the Powerhouse Alliance, architects, engineers, and environmentalists in Norway who are creating energy positive buildings in a country with some of the coldest and darkest winters on Earth. They begin with this question: is it possible to not only eliminate the carbon footprint of buildings, but also use them as a climate crisis solution? Buildings there account for about 40% of CO2 emissions. And here the figure is less, but it's still a significant 20%. It's made up of operational emissions and embodied carbon emissions that come from the building's construction. The answer to the question, yes. Norwegian firm Snøhetta has pledged to only design carbon negative buildings projects that will generate more energy than they consume in their lifetime. The Powerhouse building produces more than double the amount of electricity it consumes daily, thanks to some 3,000 square meters of solar panels. But it's not the only way. The sequestered carbon contained in the timber of this 6-story office in London named Paradise compensates for the carbon emissions generated during its construction process, as well as the first 60 years of its use. So can we do the same here? We already are, but because it's new, it tends to cost more, and we do have a huge home advantage with our easy access to sustainable timber. Here's Nelson's airport terminal, which is about 300 tons of CO2 sequestered in the timber of the building. Not yet built, this project won the Future Projects House category at the World Architecture Festival in 2012. The proposed 4-bedroom home near Wanaka utilises locally sourced timber, stone and rammed earth to create a net zero embodied carbon. Operational carbon is minimised with careful passive environmental control. The building can also be recycled at the end of its life. Then there's Scion's new campus building in Rotorua. It has taken the use of engineered timber to a whole new level with its slender diagrid and doubled skin passive ventilation facade. It's likely to set a new benchmark in carbon negative buildings. So this idea says we need to encourage more of this, but how? It starts with a robust carbon accounting framework to calculate the total carbon footprint of buildings. And this goes beyond net zero carbon. That means if we are using solar panels, you have to account for all the energy that goes into making them. We know there are barriers to rooftop solar uptake, including upfront installation costs and power companies buying any excess power at very low prices. So let's change those feed-in rates when your house or building produces more power than it consumes. In other words, show us the money. And to encourage more new buildings that are completely carbon negative over their lifetime, let's waive their consent costs. The idea here is to engage councils and power companies with incentives for individual home and building owners to address the climate crisis together in a way that's highly visible through our architecture. Thanks very much.
Fine, thank you, Chris. And extraordinary concept about carbon negative buildings and being sources of energy and then suggesting some very good financial mechanisms to do that. So thank you. Moving on to our 8th panelist is Peter Sewell, who is our 7th panelist is Simon Wilson, Director of RDT Pacific, a property construction management company. So Simon has kept sustainable construction at the very heart of his professional life from his carpentry training onwards. And he is chair of the Green Building Council's advisory group and chair of its technical subcommittee, which reviews the Green Star certification process. So over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod. Tēnā koutou, everybody. I would just like to start off by thanking everybody who's gone before me. In fact, most of my ideas have already been covered better by others. So I'm going to be repeating some of these themes. Jackie and Jade, your reference to the treaty and also involvement of iwi in the solutions is very relevant. And Chris, your presentation took everything that I was hoping to do and smashed it out of the park. So I'll probably bring my thoughts to a close pretty quickly, but it just shows you the care and consideration that people have put together in this in presenting their ideas. So well done, everybody. So the idea that I'm presenting here is effectively phrased as regenerative homes, the concept being homes that give back more than they take. Nice and simple. The problems that we've got in New Zealand, everyone's spoken to, homelessness, mental health, and people becoming disenfranchised, etc., are well understood. And people participating in this webinar will probably be well aware of Greta Thunberg and her catchphrase, "The house is on fire." We really don't have enough time to address the issues unless we take dramatic steps. So, but luckily everybody here gets that, so they're looking for ideas to address it. Regenerative homes, what am I trying to capture with that idea? It is really thinking intergenerational. Iwi already do that by practice. Perhaps Pākehā could take that on board. Think custodianship, kaitiakitanga. Think that perhaps property ownership is an issue and people should approach property as a custodian. And look at being self-sufficient. At the moment, it's almost penalised in terms of trying to build a home in Auckland in particular and try and enable yourself to be off the grid. There are various legal and regulatory constraints that are penalising what really should be celebrated and promoted. And being carbon positive. We're lucky in New Zealand to be so close to the timber production. And we were blessed with people like Gary Caulfield, who recently passed on, who's a bit of a godfather of mass timber in New Zealand, but really pushed things forward. So we've got a lot to move on with there and capture the benefit. And finally, think about power and food generation. Chris has gone into the power side in some detail, so I won't touch that, it's well covered. But also we could be looking at food production closer to our homes, small urban farms, and enabling urban farming to really take off, particularly in light of what COVID has highlighted in terms of the risk of food supply. So just revisiting what I was trying to capture in this idea. Let's look at urban farms to address food poverty, but also to provide the opportunity for community building. Let's look at intergenerational thinking. Jade, your point around iwi and Kaingaroa having a partnership, I think is a natural opportunity, which hopefully those that can make that happen will pause and reflect on that, especially combine it with quality construction. Hopefully what is built is then worth receiving back 25 years later, or etc. So really, again, circling back to the thanks to everybody else with your other ideas, which I've hopefully just added a little bit to. I think the real focus needs to be on coming to agreement within New Zealand quickly to decide how we're going to shift the current crisis into an opportunity for creating a new way for New Zealanders to live, to build, and to participate with each other. So thank you again for this opportunity. Kia ora.
Fine, thank you very much indeed, Simon. And thank you for bringing housing into this and that concept of regenerative housing, but particularly bringing food into that as well in an urban context, which I think is a very important part of helping to bring nature more fully back into our cities, and therefore people are enriched and engaged in that. Thank you. Our eighth panelist is Peter Sewell, who's a director of and Auckland regional lead of Rubix, a property construction management company, which he joined in 2006. He led the office's work to become Carbon Zero certified, and he's been a Green Star accredited professional for over 10 years. So welcome, Peter, and over to you.
Kia ora, Rod. Tēnā koutou, everybody, and thank you for the honour of talking to you today. As a sector, we already know how to create green buildings and be part of the solution in terms of sustainability and the zero carbon future. But our industry challenge is that not all of the influencers, decision makers, designers or builders are making the right decisions when it comes to green building, either through a lack of knowledge, apathy, economic reasons or whatever. Now, obviously, I'm preaching to the converted here today, and I know that almost everybody in attendance today values green buildings and speaks the green building language. I think it's incumbent on all of us to try and spread that language wider, just like the New Zealand Green Building Council are so ably doing. Now, we've already heard today from some of the responsible developers and decision makers who are doing the right thing, but the reality is that the largest developer of them all, being our government, they're not leading by example at a time when they absolutely should be. Now, this is, incredibly disappointing to me, and I'm sure to many others, especially given New Zealand's global reputation as such a progressive country. And frankly, I think our cousins over the ditch are doing better than we are. In Australia, both local and state government, for instance, require Green Star certification for most of their own buildings. So it's a real wish and hope of mine that the big upcoming spend in areas like health and education will create zero carbon buildings. But to achieve this, the Green Building Council will require all of our support to make sure that the next government prioritises this. And assuming it does, then I see a further opportunity to leverage that green spend and get some extra bang for buck. And that's the basis for my pitch today. The education spend is likely to touch the majority of schools in New Zealand over the next few years. And building green buildings in schools makes sense far beyond just the building itself. Interesting, innovative, zero carbon buildings will give us the opportunity to educate and inspire the next generation of influencers, decision makers, designers and builders who are currently sitting in those schools and will be enjoying those green buildings in the coming years. When it comes to climate change, we know that they're a very motivated bunch, as demonstrated last year when we saw student-led climate protests across the world. And I'm sure we're going to see many more of those when the COVID situation improves. This generation's hungry to learn and act in this area, so we should use the green spend in schools to help make sure that when they leave school, they can speak that green building language. They need to know why it's so important that our built sector is green and how they can be part of the future of sustainable building, which through innovation and technology such as 3D printing is going to look very different to how it has in the past. Now, many schools are already doing a great job of educating kids about sustainability through programs such as Enviro Schools. So there's already a framework that some green building education could fit in with. And we have wonderful, passionate orators in our sector that can support the effort and share that vision. My views about including the next generation were echoed at yesterday's Green Building presentation by Carolyn Cox of Green Building HQ, who talked about the work that she's been doing with school students regarding sustainability. She commented about how she found them very aware of the climate change problem, but not very aware of how they can be part of the solution. So circling back to the point I made at the beginning, we already know how our industry can solve the problems in our sector. We just need to mobilize enough people to get there. Children may only be a third of our population, but they're all of our future. and we have the opportunity to make sure that they see green buildings as being a crucial part of this future too. Thank you, Rod.
Fine, thank you very much indeed, Peter. It's a wonderful idea to get people very engaged and interested in this at a very young age, and to understand that it becomes very much a part of their lives as they go through. So thank you. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our 9th panelist, and that's Adrian Kerr, who's R&D manager at Temperzone, the Auckland-based manufacturer of heating, air conditioning and ventilation systems, with sales across Australasia and up into parts of Asia, including China. A fabulous Auckland technology and manufacturing story. So thank you for being with us, Adrian, and we very much look forward to your pitch, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod, and tēnā koutou, everyone. Look, my pitch very much builds upon the messages of Alex, the need to move away from BAU with how we go about the actual process of decarbonisation. It's very real, and I'm very inspired by Leonie's collective impact initiative, and my pitch is very much looking at the actual mechanism by how decarbonisation occurs. This week, a year ago, we spoke about requiring new buildings to be fossil fuel free by 2025 and existing buildings to be decarbonised by 2030. And I just have to ask, what's happened to those goals if we aren't able to commit to zero carbon new buildings until 2035? What hope existing buildings? What hope is there to decarbonise the rest of our energy sector? Stationary energy in buildings is among the lowest hanging fruit in our pathway to net zero in 2050. In the HVAC industry where I work in, we don't need to be installing new gas boilers into buildings for either water or for space heating. There are already low carbon alternatives for nearly every use of a gas boiler that I can think of. I'm very often asked how long a non-boiler solution will last for, and I always say that the low carbon alternatives will still be in use long after you're not able to run a fossil fuel based system. But there are challenges. It's not that the low carbon alternatives don't exist, it's that the technical knowledge is often very thinly spread, and the approach of the industry in implementing these projects is very inefficient, and there's so much duplication of effort. Projects are generated tender level specifications, which are expensive to put together, and then only one of multiple tenders will actually be successful. So my pitch is very much around how the government can help with this. So working with industry and academic leaders to put together technical specifications for low carbon solutions. Much of the technical uncertainty currently experienced at a project by project level can be eliminated. More certainty for the stakeholders and a project means less risk, and risk is always priced, and we can't waste our limited resources on paying for uncertainty. So let us work together sector by sector on putting together low carbon technical specifications based on proven best practice models. This is not to say that other options won't be considered, but where a project is presented based upon a known solution that's proven, then the pathway to funding that solution should be easier. There will be less risk, and the project should be quicker and more cost effective to deliver, and the outcome in terms of carbon reductions more predictable. The passage of the Zero Carbon Act through the House last year has provided a mandate to take decisive action on reducing our carbon emissions to net zero by 2050. The COVID-19 stimulus support has provided the catalyst government-led technical specifications will greatly assist industry in transforming our building energy systems to a low carbon future cost effectively. Thank you.
Fine. Thank you very much indeed, Adrian, and reminding us of all the low-hanging fruit that's out there with known solutions that we need to get our act together on. So an excellent suggestion there. Thank you. And our 10th and by no means our last but by no means least panelist is Mike Burrell, who's Executive Director of the Sustainable Business Council. His previous role immediately prior to that was in our Foreign Service as the New Zealand's High Commissioner in South Africa. And before that, he was Director of Sustainable Economic Development at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And previous to that, founding CEO of Aquaculture New Zealand. So welcome, Mike, and over to you, please, for your pitch.
Thanks, Rod. I'm going to throw up a PowerPoint if that's all right.
Yep.
Hopefully that's shown up. Goodness me, what a difficult act to follow. I have to say the 9 previous speakers have been fantastic. So look, as a non-building person, I'm going to pitch an idea that is something that we are pitching to government, which is that within 3 years, the new government will have worked in partnership with business and other organisations to make meaningful progress to reduce emissions in line with the ambitions set out in the Zero Carbon Act. In other words, do what you said you were going to do. The novel idea. That's the strategy that we're following, and you'll see that climate action forms one of the what's that we're following, and leadership is part of it, and thriving people is the flip side of climate action. And so that means for us working in partnership with the Climate Change Commission and all elements of government to shape carbon budgets, shape a plan and policies that will fast track progress to transition New Zealand to a zero carbon economy. The key actions for government for us are providing policy clarity and certainty to enable businesses to make those investments, often which are very, very large, and innovation decisions needed to transition to carbon zero. So while the Act does some of that, it doesn't do everything that we need. And then to work with business to develop and implement a series of projects, policies, partnerships, and R&D for both the short, medium, and long term. There are things that we can be getting on with right now. There are other things that will take a bit longer, and there are quite a number of things that will take a number of decades. But that doesn't mean that we can't start work on them now, and we need to start work on them now. So a starting point for us is a piece of work that we've already started, a report to the incoming government, which identifies specific areas of policy and investment that would accelerate that transition to a zero carbon New Zealand. Now that includes the built environment, and I'm very pleased to say that New Zealand Green Business Council has come up with some fantastic ideas which are going into this report. From today, though, I just added this slide. I think one of the most important things that I've heard from speakers today come down to these 3 words: listen, partner, and then act. The government can't do it by itself. Business can't do it by itself. We need to listen to one another. We need to partner, and then we need to take action on that. That's my 1 minute.
Fine. Thank you very much indeed, Mike. And we've got this wealth of these 10 wish lists. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now share my screen. So you will then see there on my screen the 10 wish lists we've got, the 10 big wishes we've got. First up is revitalizing local, which is Alec Tang's idea. And then second, we've got Honour to Te Reti o Waitangi, and that's Jacqueline Paul's pitch. And then next, we've got implement a collective impact to fix New Zealand's housing issues, and that's Leonie. And next up is give Hapu their land back and consider constitutional transformation a national priority, a very big and important ask by Jade there. Next up, incentives for energy positive, carbon negative buildings, which was Chris's with those wonderful illustrations of examples of that. And then next is sustainable living regenerative homes, That was Simon Wilson's wish there. Then next is to step up and lead by example in a platform to educate and inspire our next generation for green buildings, and that was Peter. And then 8 is taking a leadership role in the provision of technical specifications to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels. That was Adrian's wish. And 9th is to work in partnership with business and other organizations to make meaningful progress on the Zero Carbon Act, and that was what you just heard from Mike. And then the 10th one was take cities seriously, which was to stop sprawl, and that was from Mike Todd. So if you'd like now, please, to on your screen where you've got Slido open, make your choice there, and we'll give you just a moment to do that before we then move on to a discussion. So just click away and see where that takes you. So you can see the votes coming in, which is always fascinating to see the ebb and the ebb and flow of these. So just give it another moment longer. Oh no, here's some more come. Oh, this is good, because we've got about, I think, 170 people online, which is joining us. So it's wonderful to see this coming through here. Right, well, in the interest of time, the poll stays open. So if you still haven't made up your mind and you want to keep voting and you haven't yet, please do. So now I'm going to move on to our Q&A session here. And thank you very much for the Q&As that you've been, the questions you've been putting up there. And I see that some of them have been voted up. So please, if you want to vote up, please just click on the thumbs up on the right-hand side. So let me just jump straight in with our most popular question so far, which is from Nicholas. And that's about can we decarbonize transport by 2030? Now, let me put that to everyone on the panel, but I don't expect everyone to answer because that would be fascinating, but we would not get through many questions. So I'm just going to jump out of sharing that view. You would still be on your computer, still able to see the Q&As if you want to, but I've gone back to gallery view so I can see if there are any of our panelists would like to pick up on that question about decarbonizing transport. Any takers on that one?
Kia ora, Rod. It's Alec here from Auckland Council.
Thank you.
Look, and I'm guessing I know which Nicholas this is, and I'm guessing the question is focused on not all transport, so air travel and so on. If we're thinking about road transport emissions and rail and all that kind of stuff, then the easy answer is yes. You know, we have technology, we have the solutions out there in terms of how we can reduce particularly road transport emissions from electric vehicles, walking, cycling, public transport, the greater flexibility in workplaces, our increasing familiarization with remote working, remote living tools. So yes, I mean, the main barrier to rapid decarbonisation of transport isn't a technological one, but it is a political and a financial one. But I would say, and this is my take on the bad news, is We also know that simply decarbonising existing transport systems won't take us to that fairer, more equitable, more resilient and sustainable future that we want. It won't address that inordinate amount of time and energy that we waste moving ourselves, our goods, our services from point A to point B. And it doesn't tackle that inherent inequity that we see simply stemming from where people choose or often don't actually get to choose where to live. So yes, we can, but I guess the bigger question is, does that take us towards the bigger goal beyond that next 10 years to a more sustainable, more resilient, and great to hear those comments about resilient, a more resilient future. You know, does that answer that question is kind of my response to Nicholas's question.
Fine, thank you. Let me say, take another couple of responses from our panel. Mike, I see your hand up there. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod. I mean, my answer to that question would be, we can make a damn big dent in it. And certainly you can do that, you know, working particularly on road transport. And you can make a big dent certainly on the light fleet. I think it's absurd that we haven't made more progress on that, and we certainly can. But that's to me, it's also about working with technology and markets as well as providing policy incentives for that to happen. Heavy freight, there's a very interesting piece of work that's about to come out from a heavy freight group that will look across the value chain there about ideas for decarbonising that more rapidly, and I'm very encouraged by where that's going. So I think there's another dent, and I think that can take us further. But I think Alec is right. You know, the big items, particularly for New Zealand around air travel, international air travel, that's going to take some time. I think that's going to the technological solutions to do that are on their way. We've seen some announcements this week, you know, particularly from a reasonably prominent aviation company and some others before that. New solutions are on their way, but that will take some time. So my answer to that would be a big dent in the first 10 years, an even more significant dent in the next 10 years, and then the final amount over that last 10 years as we get to 2050.
Fine, thank you. Anybody else from the panel like to I'm sorry, I'm having trouble in seeing. Adrian, yes, I see your hand. Thank you.
As a judge a few weeks back at the R&D 100 Awards in the States, and several entries there had lithium-ion batteries that are proven their pre-production with 3 times the energy density of the current Tesla battery, and at that level, you start to get electric aeroplanes viable. So I think the improvement in lithium-ion batteries and graphene is far greater than what we appreciate at the public level at this stage. I'm very excited about it.
Thank you. Let me move on to our second most popular question from an anonymous, and it's fine to be anonymous, participant. Lots of support for this question. Do you think we should stop housing developments on high quality food growing land close to urban centres? Pukekohe, for example. Some takers on that. I'm sorry, just scrolling to see if anybody's got their hands up on that. Oh, Alec, okay, over to you.
I'll fill some time because I'm sure other people have answers. Look, for me, we need to think about cities as no longer this kind of collection of independent infrastructure requirements, and we need to think about cities as systems and networks. And one of those systems is food. Undoubtedly, food systems is one of our biggest issues. So I think we need to think very differently about how we're nurturing those systems. And as council, we need to be not just in that space of just building stuff, but actually how do we nurture those critical systems, waste, resources, food, water, obviously, and how we move around. But yeah, I think the question is, you know, when we do those assessments of where we're growing or what we're growing, have we actually thought about the emissions impact of our growth, both from does this add to our emissions? Does it make us less resilient by either taking up green space, taking up food production space, and actually put into our decision making a consideration of climate, which I don't think is actually happening right now.
Fine, thank you. And Simon, it was wonderful that you had brought the question of food into your pitch about regenerative homes. How do you see that idea developing in ways that can then obviously take the pressure off that very wonderful soil that we are arguably, well, very strong argument for, that we're using for the wrong purposes?
There's already examples of people within the inner city seeking council support for urban farming on some of their land. At the moment, it's the neighbours that are holding that back. So there's potential, there's models, there's income to be made, and jobs to be created. It seems, firstly, we just need to go back to that point which Mike made. We need to act together. So if there is a way to look at our land differently, let's do it together. And let's value food amongst other things equally, rather than just looking at pure economics. We just should look at resilience as a community. And also getting back to nature. We've got mental health issues. There is a lot of evidence to support biophilia, and being closer to nature and working with nature creates a more balanced and happier mental state. So there's so much to gain. I'm just going to pause for a second as well, because I noticed that Leonie's got a great idea that's about to leap out at us. So over to Leonie.
Thanks, Simon. I was wrapped in your ideas. So what I was just going to comment on with this is, I think that it's really important that we stand back, and it comes back to a little bit about what Todd was talking about earlier, and I thought I'd take up his mantle, seeing he's had to jump off, and that it comes back to the planning for our city. So if we look at our whole city, as Alex was talking about, as a whole ecosystem, then we need certain areas for certain things. And so it comes back to a little bit about a trade-off, and say, okay, if we want areas for high quality food growing, and we want to contain Pukekohe for that, then are we prepared as a city to perhaps be able to house people in a high density area closer to public transport networks and really make use of that infrastructure? Because there's other things that we want to plan for in a city around cultural things, around view shafts, around heritage, around iwi cultural significance areas, and all that sort of thing. So we want to make sure that our city is able to encompass that. But at the end of the day, we still need to be able to provide working spaces, places where people shop and places where people live at an affordable rate. So the challenge is, how do we get that balance so that we can actually, pull all those levers? And that's why we've got to come back to a much more coordinated approach, with clear visions for each city about where we're trying to go and what we're trying to achieve. And then I think we've got a chance to actually deliver on a lot of these outcomes. Whereas at the moment, we haven't got so much of an integrated approach.
Thank you. And I was wondering if I might ask Jacqueline and Jade, in terms of your work with communities and hapu, whether some examples of food being very sort of strongly integrated into those projects.
Ka pai. Do you mind if I go first, Jade, just quickly? So we worked with Panuku this year on a studio in Pukekohe as the Art for Transformation in the town centre. And for those who are familiar with the area, has a long history of colonial settlers within the area, and has had a significant influence on the built and natural environment out there. So we know it's still one of the richest soils out there, and a significant part of the water catchment in terms of where it goes out. So major increase in density there will have significant impacts on Te Manuka or Hoturoa, so the Manukau Harbour, what everyone calls it. And, as a reflection, right, of exclusion and racial segregation in that area. So I think within the context, and I guess for me to speak to it, it's not for me to determine, but perhaps, with the likes of Ngāti Te Ata who are hapu out there. And so for them to have a voice and be included around, what does that look like? And so whether it's, is it housing? I don't know. Maybe if we ask them, ask the communities around some of their aspirations and what's their vision for the place. And really, just because I've seen some of the work that's been going out there, some contention around car parks out there. So, just some of those trade-offs, as Leonie spoke about, around all the unoccupied car parks that could be changed and utilised for perhaps its apartments. So at a wider level, at a city level, definitely need to consider both spatial planning and economics in that sense in our food systems, and especially for our communities who continue to be gentrified across the city. Expensive to live, expensive for food, and so just some of those types of things for us to consider. And so definitely a interesting kind of space in Pukekohe, and very complex. So yeah, just some thoughts, but perhaps Jade has some ideas around what they might look like.
Yeah, kia ora. So I don't think that small scale kind of horticulture is the solution. I think it can be part of the solution. And there are a lot of people who know a lot more about it than I do, in terms of urban regenerative kind of approaches to food production. But speaking from the perspective of Papa Kāinga, consistently what we see with the clients that we work with, as well as what we're hearing more broadly from whānau hapu iwi, is that marakai are coming through strongly as a key component of all housing developments that are initiated by Māori entities, which I think perhaps goes back to my earlier point in that hapu should be central to housing development projects in their rohe, whether or not they are technically the landowner any longer and whether or not they're bringing capital to the table. Because I think you get very different social, economic and environmental outcomes when hapu are able to play a critical role. And I just wanted to give one example, and I can't take any credit for this whatsoever because it's not my initiative, but there's a garden, Amara in Kaikohe, and that's run by Matua Hiranei Po, and it's all different kinds of potatoes. It's really productive, and so they harvest these, 7 kinds of potatoes, and they distribute them to kaumātua and whānau in the rohe, and that was really important over COVID. But the reason I bring it up is because I've been involved in master planning the housing development on the land next door that the Hauora o Ngāpuhi has purchased. And so the connection with that mara has always been considered a critical part of that community, which will provide housing for Ngāpuhi tribal members right in the heart of Kaikohe. And that might be a different imperative to a mainstream developer or even Kāinga Ora itself. So just reiterating the importance of our whānau iwi hapu being involved in development, both on their own whenua, but also on land that is no longer owned by them.
Thank you. And as you can see from the Q&A, the most popular question is from Mike, which wonderfully flows on from this discussion, is how do we establish a Te Ao Māori approach to the design and planning of our cities so we can live well together with the whenua in Aotearoa? So some responses to that question.
I know I just spoke, but would you mind if I went through?
No, please do, please do.
I guess I just wanted to start by saying, the Resource Management Act and the Local Government Act allow for some degree of participation, but it's quite limited. And I think we see consistently that it doesn't go far enough. And I think what we do need is for iwi hapu mana whiriwa to be actively involved in our district plans and the statutory provisions contained within. They need to be involved in our urban design guidelines that are produced for our cities, and particularly our engineering standards. And I think that I can't say that's true everywhere, but I think in a lot of places, the participation of mana whenua in the development of those statutory documents, as well as those non-statutory documents, has been inadequate. And then moving on to a practitioner level, well, Jackie and I have done a bit of work around this, about how you might apply kaupapa Māori design principles to developments. And there's some great resources available on how you might do that as designers. But I think the critical part is the relationship. And so, mana whenua, iwi hapu, they need to be in partnership on projects. And I would say all projects, they should have the opportunity to do so. And I know that's complicated by the fact that there's differing capacity and capability, and everyone's at a different point on their settlement journey. So the ability to engage may not always be there, but I think by providing resourcing and permanent provision to do so on local government and central government projects, but then also encouraging and incentivizing private sector to do the same, I think we'll start to see a real shift.
Fine, thank you. Let me just take one or two more thoughts on that, because we have a few minutes left before I would need to revisit the poll for the final result on the poll, and then to thank people. If I may just add a view, I think it's really exciting to see how Te Ao Māori is coming through, for example, in the Primary Sector Council's new strategy and vision about Fit for a Better World, and the companion document that Te Tai Ao. As a business journalist, even more extraordinary to see the Reserve Bank embracing this and telling the story of the financial system from a Te Ao Māori perspective. So I think there is an extraordinary flourishing of this, and interest in the value for all of us in appreciating and bringing that that view into what we do. So thank you. Look, let me just go back to the poll, and I'll ask Lena to share the poll on this. There, she's just clicking there. So you can see that the strong leader from the outset there was taking cities seriously about stopping sprawl. And that is good, because that does lead us into some very creative disciplines about how we vastly improve our cities. Very exciting to see honouring the treaty, ranking second, and thirdly, working in and saying to the government, make these next 3 years really meaningful partnership and action together, listen and partnership and act, as Mike said, to show real progress on the Zero Carbon Act. And then some very strong, particular big issues coming through, whether it's partnering, as Adrian suggested, on the low carbon alternatives there, and Leonie's on taking that collective impact approach, and Chris's on energy positive, carbon negative buildings, and then Peter's on really inspiring our next generation about green buildings, and Alec on revitalizing local, and then Simon's on regenerative homes. And Jade, please don't feel the least bit that your really strong idea there about giving, making sure that Hapu have their land back. But the very big idea that New Zealand is still struggling to get its head around is about cultural transformation, it's constitutional transformation. There's been real work around that has been very rich, but has yet to be brought properly into mainstream discussion and debate. And I personally have a fervent hope that we can show that maturity of our development as a nation by considering how we reform the constitution very, very deeply around treaty to be able to progress as a country. So thank you very much to all 10 of you for contributing your ideas to this. Thank you for the 160 or so we've had online with us, which is great to have such a live audience. And thank you to the staff at the New Zealand Green Building Council, and to Ashley at Auckland Conversations for bringing this all together. And oh, there's a picture of all you panelists, that's lovely. And I just wanted to wish you all the very best in your work. And indeed, these next 3 years are, every 3 years is important, but the next 3 years is terrifically important. So I was going to say vote early and vote often. Obviously, in New Zealand, we can only vote once, but we can encourage other people to vote. We can encourage other people to get their heads around these issues. And I think, I hope that this afternoon's webinar has given us some real food for thought about how to encourage people to be active in that way. And indeed, this session has been recorded. Very soon it will be up both on the Green Building Council's website, but also on Auckland Conversations. So if you want to engage other people in these ideas and let them see what a wealth of great ideas there are there, you can refer them to back to watching and listening to a recording of this. So I just wanted to thank you all again hugely, and to wish you all the best in your work. So noho ora mai, stay well, look after yourself, and goodbye.